Okay, welcome to the Evo Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Eddie Portnoy, and I'm the academic advisor and director of exhibitions at the Evo. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Evo, we are a unique institution for the contemplation, exploration, and celebration of Yiddish language and Eastern European Jewish culture. We're located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and approximately 300,000 books. Scholars from around the world come to Evo to perform their research using these resources. In addition, we offer many classes on Yiddish language and culture, and our lecturer today is one of our instructors. We also offer exhibitions, public programs like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. Today, we will be presenting Aleksandra Jakubczak, the recipient of Evo's 2022-2023 Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellowship at the Max Weinreich Center. She's joining us today to give a lecture entitled Eastern European Jewish Women in Their Quest for a Dowry during the first half of the 20th century. Aleksandra Jakubczak is a historian specializing in the social and economic history of Eastern European Jewry in the modern period. Since 2022, she has worked as a chief historian at the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and in 2023, she received her PhD in Jewish history at Columbia University in New York. Her doctoral dissertation, entitled Sex Worker, Migrant, Daughter, The Jewish Economics of Sex Work and Mobility Between 1870 and 1939, looked at Jewish women selling and organizing sex to examine how Eastern European Jewish women experienced urbanization, industrialization, and mass migration. Her research has been supported by YIVO, the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, the Polish Academy of Sciences, the Israeli Council for Higher Education, and the American Academy for Jewish Research, among others. She was, as I said, the 2022-2023 recipient of the Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellowship at the Evo Institute. In the academic year 2023-2024, she's affiliated with the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University, where she is working on a monograph based on her dissertation. So please join me in welcoming Aleksandra Jakubczak.
Thank you, Eddie, for this kind introduction. So let me share my screen. Okay. So first I want to thank you, Eddie, and also Julia for organizing this lecture, and Eva for awarding me the Dina Abramovich Emerging Scholar Fellowship to pursue my new postdoctoral research. I really looked forward to this lecture today, and it's truly an honor for me to share my research in this forum. I'm also very happy to see some of my students among the participants who are very familiar with my research and what I'm going to talk about today. So without further ado, let me take you first to Istanbul in the Ottoman Empire, perhaps a surprising location given the lecture topic, which I promise we're going to get back to Eastern Europe in a second. It is 1907 that we are sitting together in a Russian consulate with a young Jewish woman from the Russian Pale of Settlement and Ariadna Turkova, a Russian feminist, journalist, and political activist. Turkova ventured to the Ottoman Empire to investigate the trafficking of Russian female subjects abroad and toured the brothels to locate these women and check if they had been trafficked or traveled there voluntarily. The barely 18-year-old Jewish sex worker revealed to Turkova that she had been soliciting already in Russia, but sex work there allowed her only to make ends meet. She added that she had few prospects of getting married soon because she did not have a dowry. Then she heard that if she went to Istanbul and worked in one of the local brothels, within 2 years only, she would save for a dowry, could return to Russia, and get happily married. Did this 18-year-old Jewish woman from the Pale of Settlement already had a groom? Or did she think about marriage from a longer perspective? Why did she worry about her dowry and make this rather risky step to go abroad and work in a foreign brothel to collect that money? Why didn't she get a dowry from her parents or some of the welfare organizations, or just simply take another job in her native Pale of Settlement? These questions about dowry in Jewish women's lives appeared to me while reading sources for my previous project about Eastern European Jewish women in the sex industry in Eastern Europe in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. This 18-year-old Jewish woman worried about her dowry and making active steps to achieve it was not exceptional. Once and again in my sources, I found a connection between Jewish women engaging in prostitution and their marriage plans. Many things struck me here. First, that Jewish women sold sex to amass capital for a dowry, that they sold sex and performed other kinds of labors, not in a perspective to become independent women that we would maybe expect of them, but to become wives. And finally, that despite the modernizing forces infiltrating Eastern European Jewish society for several decades already, dowry did not become a vestige of the past, and marriage apparently remained an economic arrangement, even among the lower classes to which this young Jewish woman belonged. In this talk, I will explore how the socioeconomic situation shaped the marital strategies of Eastern European Jews. And specifically, I will look at how marriage functioned as an economic arrangement and how this economic function of marriage had two effects on young Jewish women. First, that it pushed them into the labor market where they struggled to find their place, and many tried to make the best of it, like this 18-year-old Jewish woman. Second, that the quest for marriage and all of it promised in the 20th century, not only the economic stability, but as we will see, sometimes also socioeconomic and geographical mobility, pushed these women into risky and oftentimes unfavorable arrangements in which they lost control over their lives. Previous scholars have explored the modernizing processes affecting the Jewish society in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century. We know well that in the second half of the century, secular and non-Jewish education, secular literature, and ideological movements such as Bundism, Zionism, and non-Jewish ones, in particular socialism, changed Jewish society. Yet, these forces were not felt equally, and they were mediated by geography, class, and gender. Women had different opportunities in the Jewish and non-Jewish societies, different access to education, and various movements appealed to them for reasons other than they did for men. These forces certainly had effects also on intimate spheres of Jewish life, family, sexuality, and household, leading also to the reconfiguration of women's roles. Scholars have conventionally associated modernization with a shift from earlier and arranged unions toward romantic marriages, formed at a later age. Of course, it was not only for Eastern European Jews that modernization has been linked to new ideas about love, marriage, and partnership. And also in Jewish society, we see that these various movements, such as Zionism and ideologies such as socialism and anarchism, promoted new ideas for women, men, and the relationships. Literary scholars asserted that 19th century Eastern European Jews For 19th century Eastern European Jews, modernization entailed the abandonment of arranged marriage in favor of a love match. And while an examination of Jewish literature in Hebrew or Yiddish may suggest that major mental change occurred among Jews in Eastern Europe, the social reality for most of them was often different. It is true that for some women, the new opportunities and new ideas that entered Jewish homes through secular literature might have changed their worldviews and how they treated marriage. And as earlier scholars have examined, Eastern European Jewish women increasingly attended secular high schools in Eastern Europe, foreign universities. They engaged in political, social, cultural endeavors, being active in Zionist and socialist movements, various modern social organizations. They wrote and read secular literature and press. And there are some women who exemplify these new trends, such as Rosa Luxemburg, Emma Goldman, Puarakowski, who had negative views on marriage and led rather unconventional private lives. They represented this generation of new Jewish women. They were, however, exceptional figures among the millions of Jewish women in Eastern Europe who had no or little access to education or secular literature, and they actually spent most of their lives toiling. The modernization of Jewish society in Eastern Europe was uneven. It looked differently for lower and higher classes. For Jewish and these women represent rather the higher classes, the middle class. Jewish lower classes transformed as they moved from shtetls to large Eastern European cities and metropolises, where they joined the urban proletariat. They enjoyed or maybe even suffered from more anonymous environment, less communal supervision, new possibilities for meeting and mingling with people. Their experience of modernity was marked above all by increased poverty and financial difficulties experienced by Jewish families. This was that economic reality that dictated the marriage market for the masses of Jewish women from the working class, turning marriage into a financial tool to improve one's fate. Let me now explain the connection between these economic difficulties experienced by Eastern European Jews in this period and the changes in marital strategies among Jewish population. In the second half of the 19th century, Eastern Europe, and by Eastern Europe, I mean these territories, if you see the map on the left, I'm talking mostly about the Pale of Settlement and the Kingdom of Poland, which were part of the Russian Empire. Here were the majority of Jews who lived in Russia. And also I'm talking here about Galicia in Habsburg Empire, called also Austro-Hungary. So Eastern Europe witnessed uneven capitalist development, industrialization, and commercialization of the economy, which left most Jews in a worsening economic situation. Compared to other places in Europe, the Pale of Settlement in Russia and Habsburg Galicia did not witness widespread industrialization. And generally speaking, areas with high concentration of Jewish population, so here on the map on the right, you see more or less where Jews were concentrated when it comes to the Pale and the Kingdom of Poland. So in these areas, there were not so many factories, and the new industries that emerged, there were, for example, more in the north and also in the south of the Pale and all over the Kingdom of Poland. The Kingdom of Poland was actually the most industrialized area of European part of Russia at that time. These new industries that emerged there reluctantly hired Jewish workers, which I can discuss more in detail in Q&A. Pushed out from the countryside by discriminatory legislation in the Pale or lack of economic opportunities in all these areas, Jewish men flocked to the cities to fill the ranks of workshop artisans and petty traders, the luckiest to get low-skilled jobs in factory. Jews from the working class occupied rather low-skilled and low-paid positions in the unmechanized industry, as they were blocked from apprenticeships to improve their skills. By the interwar years, despite the major geopolitical changes in the region, Jews faced only growing impoverishment, as they could not change their occupational structure and engage in better paid jobs in various sectors of the economy. Not only did the Jewish artisans and petty traders lose their economic standing and could not embrace the promises of albeit slow industrialization and commercialization of the economy, but also better positioned Jews who received secular education and dreamt of white-collar jobs. They also clashed with the ceiling created by anti-Semites in interwar Poland. As the anti-Jewish discrimination increased in economic life, so did the economic problems of Jewish men intensify. Jewish men of the middle classes were being pushed down the socioeconomic ladder, and despite their education and professional experiences, they were not able to find jobs in governmental offices and companies. Others faced numerous clauses at the universities in certain professions. And as previous scholars have explored, the classing of Eastern European Jews and their growing impoverishment, especially of the lower classes, led to mass migration from Eastern Europe and the growing popularity of various movements, the ones that I already mentioned several times. And let me repeat: socialism, Bundism, and Zionism that promised alternatives for Jewish men. This growing impoverishment and declassing, meaning middle-class Jews engaging in working-class occupations such as manual jobs instead of white-collar jobs, also had far-reaching consequences for the intimate lives of Eastern European Jews and their family strategies. And as the 19th century drew to a close, a visible change in marital behavior could already be observed. Specifically, the age of first marriage of Jews had increased significantly in the last decades of the 19th century. In Russia, in 1867, 47% of Jewish grooms and over 60% of Jewish brides had not reached the age of 21. 30 years later, at the time of the first Russian census, only 6% of grooms and 25% of brides were younger than 21. And as you see also on the scan from the right, this is from the civil registry book from Habsburg Galicia. We see similar pattern also at the turn of century. In the table, you see the age of both the grooms and the brides. The grooms are all of them older than 24, and the brides are older than 21. And even you have here two of them are older than 26. And so when I looked at this book, this was the pattern. And over 20 years later, in interwar Poland, Jewish women married more often in their late 20s and 30s than in their late teens. Moreover, they're married later than their non-Jewish peers in the same region. This visible move toward later marriage did not necessarily mean that Jews were waiting with their marriage, that they took time for courtship and finding the one. Economic necessity led to this postponement of marriage. And let me explain how. Like the bourgeois who delayed their marriages because of economic necessity, which is a known fact, because the men were expected to be able to provide for their families and to be sole breadwinners, so did the working class delay their marriages for economic reasons. However, the financial pressure was both on men and women of the working class, not only on men, as in the case of the middle class. Specifically, as many sources from the period suggest, Jewish men sought to mitigate their declassing and impoverishment by taking advantage of the marriage market. Despite their ostensibly weakened position as breadwinners, Jewish bachelors were well positioned to dictate the rules of the marriage market. From the 1880s to 1930s, the proportion of Jewish men to women gradually diminished. As a consequence of war demographic losses and the mass migration, by the interwar years, there were about 127,000 more Jewish women than men in Poland. A significant proportion of these women were unmarried and had limited chances to get married, given the competition and the demands of the Jewish bachelors. The troubles in the Jewish marriage market have already been noticed in the early 20th century. Jewish journalists noted the consequences of the impoverishment and competition in the marriage market for marriageable Jewish women. In 1901, a contributor to a Hebrew newspaper, Hamelitz, explained this link. There are so many mature girls and maidens that can be found now on the Jewish street. The competition to stay alive is very acute, and there's little work while much spending. All this causes the inflated price of dowries to be more often demanded by men, and all this results in the growing number of spinsters. And while spinsterhood could have been a viable option, or maybe even wished for option among more educated and better off women like Porokowski, Rosa Luxemburg, most Jewish women at that time still wanted to get married. The high risk of marriage among Jews compared to their non-Jewish peers clearly reflect this preference among Jewish women. In 1921, around 1% of Jewish women in Warsaw were unmarried, while among non-Jews, the rates were 10 times higher. Married life was still an ideal in Jewish society, but also, given the working opportunities for women, starvation wages offered to women in the labor market at that time, single women from the lower classes had few chances to succeed without familial support or some other kind of network of support or a wage-earning partner. Yet, as these women also quickly discovered, marriage with a promising man, even of the same lower class, was not always an easy issue and required these women to offer the prospective husband a financial benefit. As marriage was an economic strategy for increasingly impoverished or declassing Jewish men, dowry, instead of becoming the relic of the past, remained a valuable asset for women and a key instrument in the economic transaction of marriage. Traditionally, the Jewish community took responsibility for raising funds to provide dowries for impoverished Jewish women. Wealthy community members and Jewish communal institutions, such as Hachnosse Skale and Charity for Poor Brides, which were established for this purpose, supported marriageable Jewish women by providing money for a dowry. Initially, these initiatives were directed to orphans who had no parents to furnish them dowry, but with deepening impoverishment of the Jewish population, there was also a growing group of young Jewish women whose parents were not in a financial position to provide them with a dowry. More and more Jewish women turned to Hachnoseskala for support. In addition, World War I created a large pool of Jewish orphans who also needed full-fledged support from these institutions of Jewish community. And as a consequence, the interwar period saw this traditional Jewish organization, the Hachnoseskale, flourishing in many towns. Their flourishment in the interwar years testifies not only to the growing impoverishment of the Jewish population, but also to the persistence of the economic meaning of marriage that dowry played an important part in. And given the growing pool of needy Jewish women, these organizations were not able to provide dowry relief to all of them. Marriageable Jewish women adapted to this new reality, a reality where market forces determined their chances of getting married, and also the reality in which they could not rely anymore on their parents and traditional institutions to help them. Editorials in the Jewish press testify to the growing pressure on young marriageable Jewish women who had to amass capital for their dowry before getting married. These articles reveal that Jewish women did not wait passively to receive support from their families or welfare organizations. In 1892, a contributor to Hebrew daily Hatzefira complained about the plight of Jewish working poor and explained how the financial difficulties of male wage earners translated into financial pressures on young women who had to undertake gainful employment in order to get married. The journalist asked rhetorically, how many fathers exhaust themselves to procure a piece of bread? How many girls spend years in heavy work and nights sitting at a sewing machine just to be able to find a husband? Another author, writing under the pen name B. Zomaher, directly linked the problems of Jewish male wage earners and young women's increased mobility and quest for a job. He wrote, life in small shtetls has become harder. The previous sources of income for Jews have been dried up. Marrying off a daughter and providing her with a dowry had always been a difficult task. But now it is even more so, as it is impossible to do so on the proceeds from businesses and trades that are pursued nowadays in small shtetls. So families send a girl from a small town to a big city to work, so she can earn some money. Jewish poverty keeps growing in small shtetls, driving out waves of immigration of even younger and more naive Jewish girls. As the families were not in a position to provide them with dowries, as Zomacher wrote in his brochure, young Jewish women flocked to the bigger cities in search of work that would help them amass capital for a dowry. Yet, as various accounts and statistics demonstrate, the emerging capitalist labor market was particularly difficult to navigate for Jewish women. At the turn of the century, Jewish women had a comparatively very low employment rate, around 22%, and another several percent of unreported women who worked in family businesses as helpers. To compare, non-Jewish women had in Eastern Europe had much higher employment rates, even if we exclude agriculture. In the 1930s, despite the disproportion of women over men among Polish Jews, women represented roughly 35% of gainfully employed Jews. To compare, non-Jewish population had these ratios almost even, representing equally the proportion of men and women in the population. Not only the rates of female employment differed between Jews and non-Jews of Eastern Europe, but also occupational structure and labor strategies of women. Throughout this time, around half of these employed women, Jewish women, worked in commerce, but these were probably married women who sold products in the marketplace, they peddled something, maybe they worked in some family business, shop, etc. Another dozen of employed Jewish women worked in industry, which is more similar to artisanry, and another few percent worked as domestic servants, and others in various kinds of personal services. To compare, for non-Jewish female population, the most common strategy to make a living in the city and wait for marriage was domestic service. Over 30% of employed non-Jewish women worked as domestic servants. All of them were single, usually young. Due to official and unofficial discrimination of Jews in Eastern European economy and Jewish culture of labor, things looked quite differently for young Jewish women. So actually, what these single Jewish women were doing for a living? Despite the dire need to make a living, to sustain themselves until married, but also, as we just said, also to amass capital for a dowry, young Jewish women had few opportunities to find employment. Unemployment and underemployment affected the masses of Eastern European Jews at the turn of the century. Cecilia Bobrovskaya Zelikson, future revolutionary and Bolshevik, who relocated to Warsaw from the Pale of Settlement at the turn of the century, has ably described this competition for work in the female labor market in her memoir. She wrote, "In 1894, unemployment in Warsaw was very great. Near the factory gates, there were crowds of other girls willing to work for the most meager wage. Eventually, after jostling with the crowds of unemployed, near the gates of lace, tobacco, cigarette, chocolate, and other factories, I had to content myself with work in a small shop." And by this shop, she means some kind of a workshop. Some Jewish women found employment in large factories, especially in Jewish-owned factories, for example, in Białystok and the Vilnius areas, factories of textile, tobacco, matches, and lace. These were the most common for Jewish women to work in. But also their situation working in the factories was quite difficult. They worked for many hours to receive very meager pay. Yakov Perelman's work documenting the life of Jewish working class in the Pale at the beginning of the 20th century recounted the terrible fate of Jewish female weavers. He wrote, "Jewish girls also work in this weaving mill in Białystok. They earn between 1 ruble and 50 kopecks to 2 rubles per week for their winding on a spool. It suffices to look at their saddened faces to comprehend that these girls have not enjoyed yet a happy youth, and their best years wear off on endless work and perpetual want." These young women, either in domestic service or in factories and workshops, treated their employment as temporary and hoped that marriage would save them from this difficult position of exploited workers. A survey conducted by Jewish Colonization Association in the early 20th century Pale of Settlement revealed that unlike the local Christian population, Jewish women as a rule participated in gainful employment in factories and alike only until marriage. Jewish philanthropic organizations hope to improve Eastern European Jewish socioeconomic situation, offering vocational training to young Jewish women in the Pale and Galicia, but they discovered little interest, they reported. The women themselves rarely wanted to invest in their training, similarly to their parents, because they had no resources, but also because they treated women's job as a temporary solution, only until marriage. Jewish social activists in the interwar period deplored the low rates of employment of Jewish women and the condition of their professional training. Join, or very famous organizations, and also others, began establishing professional courses for young Jewish women in interwar Poland, just like Jewish Colonization Association did in Galicia and the Pale earlier in the century. Recognizing the women's dependence on welfare and their parents to amass capital for a dowry, and that both their parents and community could not help them in the times of growing impoverishment of Jewish population and masses of orphans, these Jewish social activists representing these organizations called for professionalization of Jewish women, especially in the clothing industry. In 1927, Jewish social activist, Zionist, and pedagogue Cecilia Klaftenova wrote about the necessity of women's gainful employment. She wrote, "Life itself, and especially the experiences of the Great War, incomparable women's humiliation, suffering, and poverty, became the warning. Jewish women who stayed at home or were in a flight from their home, widowed or ruined financially and uprooted, had in these circumstances to assume the responsibilities unknown to them previously." Indeed, it was World War I that further pushed the agenda of universal work among Jews. The war brought separation from men, who were the main wage earners. It turned out that women struggled with surviving without men, that they had been accustomed to supporting the family financially, but only as a supplement, not a regular job outside the home. Calls for the professionalization of women focused not only on artisanry, especially in the clothing industry, but extended to other professions such as domestic service. As domestic service was less affected by economic downturns and drew large masses of single non-Jewish women, Polish Jewish Zionists and social activist Róża Melcerowa called for greater Jewish employment in domestic service, a greater professionalization of servants who would also attend vocational schools of house management. She believed that domestic service can solve the problem of large number of young Jewish women without work, being burdened to their families. There was, however, not much to be done. to alleviate the situation of young Jewish women. Impoverishment affected the entire Jewish society, and the pool of jobs was only shrinking. During the Great Economic Crisis, in some companies, discharges mainly affected women, as their employment was considered temporary, supplementary, while men remained at work because they were believed to be family breadwinners, even if they were unmarried. In other factories and workshops, women, together with children, replaced discharged men as they were treated as cheap labor. In the early 1930s, the unemployment in typically Jewish sectors of the economy, such as clothing industry, so all kinds of tailors, seamstresses, etc., reached even 80%. And this woman that represents my lecture is probably one of the victims of this massive unemployment in the clothing industry. In the meantime, despite the limited opportunities, Jewish women did not wait passively and were quite resourceful by seeking ways to make a living until they got married, and ideally amass capital for a dowry. While the social activists such as Meltserova, who directed them to low-paid jobs such as domestic service, or like Klaftenova to become seamstresses that actually oversaturated the market. Young Jewish women had other employment options that were rather unaffected by economic downturns, always were in demand, and paid better than all the jobs available. And this was sex work. The same Meltserova complained in 1927 in London at the International Jewish Congress on trafficking, and Jewish women in interwar Poland preferred taking up prostitution over domestic service. The same year, Wacław Zalewski, author of a brochure about sex industry in Poland, described the connection between prostitution among young Jewish women and their quest for dowries. He wrote, "In the same way as previously, before World War I, a proportion of young girls from the Jewish proletariat engage in professional prostitution, but only temporarily. They become prostitutes to save money for their dowries and then get happily married." Other Polish commentators in interwar Poland who studied prostitution corroborated this function of sex work for single Jewish women, stressing that Jewish lower classes, for no other option, accepted temporary sex work as means of establishing a normal family life. And just to compare, non-Jewish women usually treated sex work as more permanent job, and we don't have so many accounts that non-Jewish prostitutes were getting married after leaving prostitution. While sex work in Eastern Europe was much more profitable than domestic service or a factory job, and it could have served as temporary solution for financial troubles, it rarely was a way to raise substantial funds quickly, as the 18-year-old women from the Pale told Turkova in Istanbul. With the increased opportunities to immigrate in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, migration offered better economic prospects, and also migration for the purposes of prostitution. And while typically Jewish migration from Eastern Europe has been presented as unidirectional for the purposes of permanent settlement, a family migration, some Eastern European Jews, including young single women, practice different form of migration, a more similar one to that of their non-Jewish counterparts, labor migration. And this 18-year-old Jewish woman from the Pale of Settlement that I began this lecture with was not alone in her strategy, which is migrating abroad for a certain period of time, earning their money and returning home to Eastern Europe, for example, to get married. It was kind of an investment. But unlike men who migrated for jobs, women had very limited employment opportunities also in other countries at that time, and sex industry had particular appeal to them because it did not require skills and capital, always welcoming newcomers and immigrants. We're discussing here that young Jewish women needed to amass capital for dowry and that they sought various ways to do so. They took up jobs in artisanry, domestic service, and sex work, and that Jewish social activists tried to assist Jewish women in their precarious situation, redirecting them to various economic pursuits and making them more competitive on the labor market so they can find maybe better paid jobs and perhaps even stay employed after marriage. But what does lack of a dowry mean for Jewish women and their marital strategies? What if they didn't get a dowry from their parents, or they didn't earn it by working somewhere? And as we said, they preferred not to become spinsters. Between 1880s and 1920s, Jewish press in Poland and reports of the Jewish international organizations combating trafficking were replete with trafficking stories that actually began under the chuppah, the wedding canopy. Yiddish literature, for example, Das Windschwingerl by Mendele Mochesforim, also depicted how young Jewish women were being pushed into marriages by their impoverished families. Anti-Semitic observers, as well as German Jewish visitors in Galicia, such as Berta Pappenheim, accused Jewish parents of selling their daughters into the hands of traffickers. Indeed, in some families, poverty might have made these families and their daughters without marriage prospects to make difficult decisions, accepting risky offers of marriage. Jewish women without dowries or substantial dowries from poor families, unable to amass capital for a dowry themselves, could have entered abusive relationships, as young women or their parents accepted offer of marriage from almost strangers who did not demand the dowry or offer them a better life abroad. These fears of fake marriages to abused, impoverished Jewish women without dowries materialized in the interwar period, when immigration restrictions made marriage an important tool for women's socioeconomic mobility. By the second half of the 1920s, migration became a privilege that few lucky people could embrace. As they were basically unable to immigrate as single women, Polish Jewish women needed to get married to move abroad and escape the dire poverty or the classing in interwar Poland. The US and Argentina hindered the immigration of Eastern European Jews, but had some exceptions for wives of citizens and residents who could enter beyond the quota or with some preferential treatment within the quota. Those who had a dowry or other substantial capital could choose their grooms or even fake grooms from abroad just to enter the country. Others without means enter risky marital arrangements that promise them mobility, geographic, and, as they hoped, socioeconomic one abroad. It was this period when marriage assumed new meanings for Polish Jewish women who hoped to improve their fate. Young women married or got engaged to men with citizenship or residency, for example, in Argentina or in the US, who had rights to bring their fiancés or wives to these countries. It was then when mostly married or wives-to-be Eastern European women were reaching the shores of Argentina. Some of them were later found to be exploited. And this was, for example, the case of Ella Brandla from Warsaw. In 1928, Ella, a widow and a mother of two, was 27 years old when she married Isaac Fair, 13 years her senior, a resident of Argentina. Immediately after the wedding, the newlyweds sailed to Argentina, leaving Ella's children with her parents in Poland. After several months of silence, her parents in Poland received a letter from their daughter that her newlywed husband had forced her into prostitution in Buenos Aires. Ella begged her parents' intervention. She wanted to go back home and reunite with her children. How did this woman find herself in these circumstances? We can speculate that her situation in Poland was not easy. As a young widow with children, Ella had very few chances to remarry, to have a job that would sustain her with two children, and to immigrate, as the gates of all countries were closed to adult and married women, let alone with children. All of them would be considered a possible public burden. She lived with her parents since her husband and a father of her children passed away. How long did she know Isaac Fair, whom she married? Was this a true or fake marriage? We can speculate that she accepted his offer of marriage as it promised her maybe financial support and possibly a better life in Argentina. We can also speculate that they contracted a fake marriage, and she could have been an active, though unequal partner in this deal that would get her into Argentina as the law prescribed. Based on other cases, we can also speculate that she paid him accordingly or was to pay him off by prostitution, an occupation that might have turned out too difficult for her to bear. As the letter to her parents states, when she refused to stay in the brothel, her husband beat her severely. There was no alternative life for her in Argentina. This story, however, despite the speculations that we just make, it clearly hints at the links between marriage and mobility in the 20th century and the limited options women, single, but also young widows who also were on the marriage market, the limited options they had, and that these limited options pushed many of them into risky arrangements and undesirable situations, especially when they had no means, such as dowry. To summarize and to end this lecture, Despite the encroachment of modernizing forces in Eastern European Jewish society from the second half of the 19th century, marriage remained a goal for many young Jewish women and a tool to stabilize or improve their socioeconomic situation. The growing impoverishment of the Jewish population and adversary economic forces that brought declassing on Jewish men and women turned marriage into an economic arrangement and a dowry a market tool. And instead of turning into a vestige of the past and giving space to love and companionship, dowry, the necessity to have it and risk of lacking it, pushed many Jewish women into exploitative labor market. The interwar immigration restrictions inscribed new meanings of marriage in Eastern Europe, making it more an arrangement that promised life's improvement, but also entailed risks. Women enter unfavorable arrangements when they could lose control over their lives, and instead of liberating themselves through labor and physical mobility, they remained in the patriarchal structures as wives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aleksandra. That was really, really fascinating. This is a topic that is not a typical Jewish historical topic. And I'm glad, having seen, I've gone through the Yiddish press fairly extensively, and I've seen this in my own work, these articles about shtilachasnas, about human trafficking, these kinds of things. It's really fascinating and was a significant issue in Jewish life and before World War II. So it's fantastic that that you've done this work. I just want to let everyone know that if you have questions for Aleksandra, please leave them in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we'll be happy to get to them. I find it remarkable that the phenomenon of the dowry remains so prevalent, even with what's clearly the modernization of society that's taking place. So I wonder if you could speak to that a bit. Just why did that remain such a central component of Jewish life?
Well, so how I tried to also explain in this lecture, I believe it was specifically because of the economic conditions. It was not because it was a part of a tradition. It was not among people who are more traditional, but it was understood as a very important part of the marriage, and marriage as a way to improve one's life. And with this growing impoverishment of Jewish men, we see that they also saw dowry as the women's investment in the marriage. So we have cases, for example, of men who take a dowry to buy a shop or to sponsor their migration abroad. My colleague from Columbia, she's working on a dissertation showing precisely how many Jewish men in interwar Poland were getting married only to get a dowry to sponsor their migration abroad, and then they were abandoning their women because they were not actually interested in the marriage, but they were interested in this in the women's money. So I think it's just because of this growing impoverishment of men, they recognize dowry as a maybe easy way, because it's sanctioned by tradition, to get some capital and make investments. So I would see it this way. It was I would say, yeah, I would say it's an economic tool for in modern times, but it's supported by tradition, so it's approved by the society. So also it doesn't look like they're doing something wrong.
Right. So and just out of curiosity, was this prevalent only among Jews or throughout Eastern Europe and among other ethnicities? This phenomenon of the dowry is having this economic function.
I don't know. I expected this question. So I always try to I expect the questions about the comparisons with the non-Jewish population. I actually started to look into this. And I don't know about the lower classes, but certainly among the middle classes, we still see an importance of a dowry in interwar Poland, and also in the partitioned time. We see many announcements among men who look for wives, and they offer, for example, I don't know, they're educated men, they have a store, but they need a dowry to also to expand their business or to migrate. So we see these trends, but I would say among more middle class. And I don't know of any research about the lower classes. Maybe I should delve into this to check if it's also among the lower classes. Definitely, we see that also the non-Jewish working class in the late 19th century, they're also postponing their marriages. So the marriages of those peasants who are migrating from the countrysides to the cities, they get married much later than they did in the countryside, which is also connected to money, because they have to wait to amass enough money to get a stable job to start a family, and this was not their worry in the countryside.
Right. Wow. Really interesting. Okay, so we have a couple of questions. Joel Neuberg asks, was there any shame associated with prostitution? Would the groom know that the bride had been a prostitute?
We can assume that in some cases, yes. I saw cases of fiancés sending the female fiancés to work abroad as prostitutes. I have also cases of husbands who are sending their already Jewish wives to work as prostitutes. So I would, not to generalize, but I think for some it wouldn't be a problem, especially that they endured many economic difficulties. So they would understand that this is the necessity, and this is what women should do to help them to improve their economic situation. But I can also say that definitely some women would have preferred to hide this information, and I think that's why they also preferred to migrate abroad to practice prostitution, because it would not be known in their hometown. So prostitution, especially by Jewish women, I notice it's usually practiced not in their hometowns, it's in other towns, cities, or regions in Eastern Europe and abroad, probably also connected to the shame that their family, their community would not know about this. So they would have maybe better chances to get married when they're back at home. Maybe not with the low positioned men in their community, but maybe someone better positioned who wouldn't know that she had been a prostitute.
Right, thanks. And again, if anyone has questions, leave them in the Q&A section, not the chat. And there are a couple more questions that are sort of adjacent to the answer that you just gave. Someone asked if sex work, if that method of raising a dowry was an open secret, and if you find accounts of husband and parents being aware of it. And then the same person asked, when did the need for a dowry go away? Or
well, I would say until the Holocaust, I see that it doesn't go away. So I don't know what would have happened if Eastern European Jews would still live there in Eastern Europe, but I don't think it stayed in the immigrant community so much. I'm not sure what happens after World War II in these immigrants communities of Eastern European Jews in Argentina, in Palestine, or North America. But I think generally the dowry goes away in mid-20th century. That's my guess. But for the entire period that I studied, that is until the Holocaust, it's still very prevalent.
Right. Someone is asking here if you found that ketubas are a useful source of data.
Actually, I struggle to find ketubot from Eastern Europe. If somebody has some database, I would be grateful, because actually I believe that some of these information, how big was the dowry, should be stated in ketuba. So I would love to see some ketubot from Eastern Europe from that time period. But I didn't even see them as attachments, like a copy of ketubah was not part of like an attachment to civil registries. So I saw marriage contracts or like summaries of marriage of wedding ceremony in civil books in Eastern Europe, and they don't mention any financial aspect. So I guess everything was in ketubah and tnoim before. Yeah.
Right. Here's a question. Were there any instances of single Jewish women providing mutual aid to each other? For example, in terms of sharing residences or pooling a small portion of income?
I never encountered any, though I know of cases that some women working in one factory, they pulled, I think not only women, but in factories when there were many Jewish women working, they had special funds, something like Hachnosis Kole, but just for the women who were working in this specific factory. So it was not it was not sponsored by some wealthy Jewish community member or Jewish community, but it was part of like a working space. So this I saw at like a Kachnosis school of a certain factory where there were majority of workers were Jewish women.
Right. Someone here is asking how prevalent was matchmaking at the time? And they specify in the shtetl in the 1920s, but it could really be anywhere. And, this is kind of an interesting question because this was, a certain relevant occupation in the Jewish community. And, I assume that modernity had a significant effect on this occupation. So what does, women finding their own dowries? I mean, would matchmakers, for example, suggest that they go to work to create a dowry? I don't know. I mean, this is just, I'm asking you.
That's a good question that I'm not sure how we could even measure to what extent it was prevalent, the matchmakers. What I noticed that people who maybe not much, but introduce many of the women, for example, those women who end up sex workers or being trafficked, they're actually introduced to these men by women who are procurers of domestic servants and other workers. So we see that women who are just connecting women to jobs, they also introduce them to men. So we see this, for example, but I've never heard about like matchmakers involved in these stories. Actually, I felt that in many of these accounts about Jewish women and dowries, there was not a single shidduch and matchmaker involved. But I'm sure there were some kind of matchmakers. I would assume that maybe it's less professional than it used to be, that people who matchmake are having also other kinds of jobs related to matchmaking. Like I said, like to procure someone's a job in a factory or a domestic service. So they just know many people and they just introduce them to women, to men, etc.
Right. So someone's asking here, was this phenomenon practiced by or at least Jewish women in the sex trade making money for dowries? Was this practiced by the Orthodox community? And there's a second question in connection to that. Someone's asking about affluent families who competed to marry daughters to prominent scholars. And do you see this as something distinct from less wealthy women working to pay or to create money, create funds for a dowry for themselves?
That they would like to get married with scholars or?
But yeah, this was always sort of tradition, and it's to a certain degree related to the question about orthodoxy, because that was more prevalent in that community than among others.
I think this would not work. I think the Orthodox, especially the family of the I don't know, Talmid Chochem, would be quite suspicious what this woman was doing when she was absent, because women were also migrating to work for other not only in sex work, but they were also going to another cities and leaving their community behind. So it's not obvious what they were doing when they were away. But I think whatever they were doing, it was already a little bit of shame and suspicion, what they're doing there, how do they behave there. And we have at that time many articles in Jewish press shaming Jewish women for their behavior, for how they dress, for how they speak. Where do they go in the cities? For example, they go to dance halls, and also Hasidic women, for example, in Warsaw. So I think it wouldn't work in Orthodox Jewish community so much. And regarding this acceptance, I don't know if the first question, if I understood correctly, if the Orthodox Jewish community to some extent accepted this strategy of Jewish women to be sex workers?
I mean, I think that was the intention of the question. Or if it existed, maybe not, maybe
it
just
existed, but it certainly was not accepted. So we have Jewish prostitution in quite small towns. For example, in Galicia, we have shtetls with majority of Hasidic population, and there were Jewish prostitutes working there. So we see prostitution not only in big cities, but also in these small communities. We can assume that these women were not specifically from these communities, but I'm sure it disturbed also these Hasidic communities that these were Jewish women selling sex next to them. But also women from these more religious homes, we know that they also worked as prostitutes, but usually they were already singled out from their families. There was less of an acceptance than among the less observant working class families, where the financial troubles mattered more than religiosity. We see that some of Jewish women who were sex workers, they still exhibit some kind of religiosity. Some of them they keep kosher, they go to mikveh, and they also go to synagogues. And in Brazil, they have their own Hebra Kadisha and their own praying hall. And now there is I heard about new research about mikveh for Jewish prostitutes in Buenos Aires. So it's not that despite that they were singled out by their religious families, they still, some of them kept some level of religiosity.
right. And that's, the fact that these kinds of things existed, it's to go back to a previous question, this does seem to be a form of kind of mutual aid, where these women are banding together and creating these sort of these sort of things. Someone asks if was having done sex work a social barrier to marrying well. I mean, that marrying well could mean a lot of different things, but they don't specify.
So as I said, if we mean by marrying well is like to a person of a higher status, either we mean of a yiches or of like a higher learning, of maybe of a higher class, for example, middle class, I think it would be a barrier, but not necessarily sex work, but as I said, all kinds of women behavior that women were suspected of when they were working away from home. So people were worried what they were doing there. So this already brought some shame on these women. But for these women, so what I try to tell here, it was difficult for these women from the working class to marry similarly low position men of the working class, because all of them demanded a dowry. So for these women did not aspire to work in prostitution to become middle class women. They just wanted to get married within their own class, because that was the only available thing, and it was also very hard to get married.
Right. You get to a couple of questions before we close. Someone's asking if you're familiar with Talia Carner's novel, The Third Daughter.
Yeah.
And if so, what's your opinion of it?
I found it very interesting. So just to summarize for people, this author is taking the other Tevi's daughter the one that just appears by name in the stories, but we don't know her story. So she makes up a story for the other Tevye's daughter. So for her, there were like various paths for Jewish women. One was conversion, the other one was a socialist movement, and then this one would be sex work, being trafficked to Argentina. So actually, I really enjoyed reading it, but I tend not to present these women as so passive and as victims. I would give them more agency. As I tried today during the talk, that they had what they needed to do, and actually it was quite resourceful. And they were, even when sometimes they look like victims, they had some agency on the way, and this was their way to survive very difficult times in Eastern Europe.
Right. We'll just do one last question. This is kind of someone's personal anecdote. She's saying the upper middle class of my grandmother's family in Lublin, who married around 1910, welcomed the couple and later also their two children to live in their large apartment for over 2 decades. She's asking, would you consider that a kind of dowry?
So we have in Eastern European Jewish society 2 kinds of, let's say, capital, or the benefit that woman is bringing, and this was caste. And that the family, the newlywed would live with the family of the wife, and probably it was instead of a dowry, because 20 years is a bit of an exaggeration. So maybe because they were not able to give them a dowry so they can buy their own place or rent, it was a better deal for both the couples to offer them a very, very long test of 20 years.
Right. Great. Well, listen, thank you so much. This was a really fascinating and compelling topic. And I think we all look forward to seeing your further research on this, and, hopefully a book relatively soon.
Yeah, hopefully. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks everyone for joining us. This has been a YIVO Fellowship lecture. Aleksandra Jakubczak was the 2022-2023 Dina Abramovich Fellow at YIVO. And if you liked what you saw today, please consider making a donation, because we cannot support these scholars without your help. So again, thanks to everybody, and thanks to Dr. Jakubczak. And we will see you at the next fellowship lecture.